Clara Whitmore drove the shovel into the frozen ground with both hands, not to plant, not to dig, but because if she stopped moving, she would fall apart right there on that godforsaken hill. 3 weeks after burying her husband. 6 acres of broken rock and frozen dirt that nobody wanted. And Harrison Caldwell's voice still ringing in her ears from that morning. Sell it, Clara. A woman like you can't work land like that. A woman like you can't do much of anything. She drove the shovel in again, harder. If this story already has you feeling something, please take 1 second right now and hit that subscribe button. Follow along until the very end, because what this woman did next is going to stay with you. And drop a comment below, telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Harrison Caldwell came to her door, Clara had already been awake for 4 hours. She had not slept well since Thomas died. She had not slept well since they lowered him into that hard Colorado ground with 12 other men from the mine collapse, all of them in pine boxes that the company paid for because it was cheaper than admitting fault. She had been drinking coffee at the kitchen table when she heard the horses. 2 of them, expensive ones. She could tell by the sound. That deliberate, unhurried clop of animals that had never worked a day too hard in their lives, owned by a man who hadn't either. Harrison Caldwell knocked twice. Sharp, efficient. The knock of a man who expected the door to open before his knuckles finished moving. Clara set down her coffee cup. She did not rush. She was a large woman, had been her whole life, and she had learned young that the world wanted her to apologize for the space she took up. To move faster, shrink smaller, make herself easier to dismiss. She had spent years accommodating that expectation, squeezing through doorways, sideways when she didn't need to, sitting in the back of rooms, letting conversations move past her like a river moves past a rock. Thomas had never asked her to do any of that. Thomas was gone, and she was standing in her own doorway now, on her own property, taking exactly as much time as she needed. Mrs. Whitmore. Harrison Caldwell tipped his hat. He was tall, silver-haired, with the kind of permanent tan that came from standing on land you owned and watching other people work it. Behind him, his hired man, a thin fellow named Silas, held both horses and stared at the ground. "I hope I'm not intruding." "You are," Clara said. "But go ahead." Something moved behind his eyes. A flicker of surprise, quickly covered. He was not accustomed to women answering him that way, especially not women in Clara's situation. "I'll get straight to the point," he said. "I want to buy your land." "I know. I'm prepared to offer—" "I'm not selling." The words came out calm. She hadn't known she was going to say them until they were already in the air between them. But once they were there, she felt the truth of them settle into her chest, like something finally set down after being carried too long. Caldwell's expression didn't change. Men like him had practiced faces for moments like this. "Clara," he said, and she noticed the shift, first name now, the kind of familiarity men used when they wanted to remind a woman of her place. "I understand you're grieving, and I respect that, truly. But you need to be realistic. That hillside is 6 acres of rock and dead root. Every farmer in this valley has tried and failed on that land. Your husband himself. Don't." Her voice was quiet, but it stopped him cold. He waited. "Don't tell me about Thomas," she said. "Not today, not ever, when it comes to business." Caldwell reset himself, cleared his throat. "The offer is $200. That's fair money, Clara. More than fair. You could take it to Denver, start fresh somewhere easier." $200. Clara had done the math already. Had done it the night before at that kitchen table, by lamplight, with Thomas's ledger open in front of her, and her fingers tracing numbers he had written in his careful, slanted hand. She knew what the land was worth on paper. She knew what her debt was. She knew exactly how thin the margin was. "No," she said. "You haven't even thought it through. I've thought about nothing else for 3 weeks." She looked at him steadily. "My answer is no, Mr. Caldwell. If that changes, you'll be the first to know." She closed the door. She stood with her back against it and listened to the sound of those expensive horses turning around in her yard. She listened until they were gone. Then she pressed both hands flat against the wood and breathed. Her hands were shaking. She had not been that certain of anything since Thomas was alive. She didn't know if that was courage or stupidity. She suspected it might be both. The land her father had bought 30 years ago was not good land. Everyone in Willow Creek would tell you that freely, without being asked. The hillside on the eastern edge of the Whitmore property rose at an angle that made plowing nearly impossible, the soil running thin over a base of pale fractured rock, the whole 6 acres catching wind from the north in winter and losing moisture twice as fast as the flat fields below. Her father had tried wheat. It failed. Her father had tried corn. It failed slower, then failed completely. Her father had tried sheep, briefly, before deciding the terrain wasn't worth the broken legs. When he died, he left the land to Clara and Thomas with the quiet embarrassment of a man passing on an argument he'd never managed to win. Thomas had been an optimist. He'd looked at the hillside and said, "We'll figure it out." He'd spent 3 years trying to figure it out. Then the mine collapse happened, and the figuring out became Clara's problem alone. She walked the hill the afternoon after Caldwell left. Not to plan. She didn't have a plan yet. She walked it because the house felt too small, and the kitchen table felt like a place where grief sat waiting for her every time she held still. And the hill, the useless, impossible, embarrassing hill, was at least something to move through. She walked it slowly. Her knees ached. They always ached on cold mornings, had since her 20s, and she'd long since stopped apologizing for her pace. She picked her way between outcroppings of pale limestone, through patches of scrub brush, past the places where Thomas had pulled rocks out and stacked them in low walls that went nowhere and accomplished nothing. She stopped near the top, where a cluster of old wooden barrels sat half buried in dirt. Her father's barrels, or her grandfather's. She'd never been sure. They'd been there as long as she could remember, those big old whiskey casks and flour barrels, some cracked, some collapsed, some still holding their shape with the stubborn dignity of objects that hadn't been told they were useless yet. She stood and looked at them for a long time. Something her mother had said came back to her. Not as a memory exactly, more as a sensation, the way certain things a person you loved once said come back as feelings before they become words. Her mother in the old garden behind their house in Tennessee, kneeling in the dirt, pressing seeds into the dark soil with her thumb. Clara had been small then, 7, maybe 8. Some things won't grow where the world expects them to, her mother had said. You have to find them a place that fits what they need, not what everyone else has decided they ought to have. Clara had been thinking about her mother's strawberries. Small, intensely sweet. Grown in a raised wooden planter her father had built from old barrel staves. The planter kept the soil warm and dry, kept the roots from sitting in water during heavy rains, and the fruit had been extraordinary. Better than anything grown in the flat garden beds that everyone else in the county used. Clara had thought about those strawberries off and on for 20 years. She had never done anything about it. She crouched down beside the nearest barrel. Solid oak staves, still holding. The wood was weathered to silver gray, but the iron hoops were intact. She pressed her palm against the side and felt the faint ghost of warmth that wood holds even in cold weather. Around her, the valley spread out below in the early spring light. The flat farms, the brown fields waiting to be turned, the rooftops of Willow Creek just visible beyond the cottonwoods along the creek. Everything below her was organized into the shapes that people expected farming to take. Straight furrows, flat fields, right angles. Everything up here was wrong angles and bad rock and old barrels. Some things won't grow where the world expects them to. Clara stood up slowly. She was breathing hard from the climb, and her cheeks were windburned, and her knees were sending clear messages about their opinion of this entire situation. She looked at the barrels. Then she looked at the valley. Then she went back to the house and found Thomas's old seed catalog. Martha Collins was 71 years old and had been farming the Colorado Territory since before it was a territory. She was small and brown and leathery, and she moved through life with the efficient economy of a woman who had never once had time to waste on anything that wasn't real. Clara found her at her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, sorting seed packets with the focused attention most people reserved for important documents. "Martha," Clara said, "I need to ask you something." Martha didn't look up. "Ask." "Strawberries, planted in barrels, elevated off the ground. Is there a reason it couldn't work?" Martha's hands stopped. She set down the seed packet she was holding and looked at Clara for a long moment with the particular expression she had, the one that meant she was taking something seriously that other people would have laughed at. "That hillside of yours," Martha said. "Yes." "Rocky drainage, wind exposure on the north face." "Yes." "Shallow topsoil over limestone." "Yes." Martha picked up her coffee cup and held it for a moment. "Strawberries like elevation," she said finally. "They like good drainage. They don't like their roots sitting in water or cold ground." She paused. "And they like warmth around the root system that you can't always guarantee in open soil." "But in barrels," Clara said, "with the right soil mix." "In barrels," Martha said slowly, "you control the environment. You control the drainage. You control the warmth. You protect the roots from ground frost." She set her cup down. "Where'd you get this idea?" "My mother grew them that way, in Tennessee." Martha was quiet again. Then she said, "I have runners. Extra plants from last season that I was going to compost. You could have them. I can't pay you right now. I know that." Martha's voice was not unkind, but it was matter-of-fact in the way that honest people are matter-of-fact. "You can pay me when you sell the berries. That's how it works when something is worth believing in." Clara felt something catch in her throat. She pressed it down. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Martha said, already reaching for her coat. "Thank me when Caldwell's face turns red, watching them buy your fruit instead of his." The work very nearly broke her. That is the truth of it, and the story deserves to have it said plainly. The work very nearly broke Clara Whitmore in the spring and summer of 1878. And there were mornings when she lay in bed in the gray pre-dawn dark and held absolutely still and simply tried to locate some reason to get up. She was not built for self-pity. Thomas had loved that about her. "Clara doesn't pity herself," he'd told people, and it was true, mostly. But she was built for honesty, and the honest truth was that some mornings, the weight of everything, the grief, the debt, the doubt, the bone-deep exhaustion, sat on her chest like something physical. She got up anyway. Every morning. Before sunrise, while the valley was still gray and cold and nobody was watching. The first challenge was the barrels themselves. She needed to move them, 18 of them, the ones that were still sound enough to use, from where they sat scattered across the hillside to the locations she'd mapped out, positions that caught the most southern light and sat along the natural drainage contours of the rock. Each barrel weighed close to 60 pounds empty. Clara weighed 240 pounds. Her body was the subject of consistent public commentary in Willow Creek. She was accustomed to the looks, the muttered observations, the way people's eyes went to her, and then away with that particular expression that meant they had formed an opinion and were now waiting to see it confirmed. She had learned to carry herself through that scrutiny with her chin level and her pace deliberate, to refuse to let the world's eye turn her into something ashamed of the space it occupied. But moving heavy barrels up a rocky hillside alone was different. It required her to use her body in full view of anyone who passed on the road below, in all its heaviness and effort and sweat. It required her to be visible in a way she usually managed to control. The first day she worked the barrels, 3 boys from town stopped on the road and watched. She heard them from the hillside. "What's she doing?" "Looks like she's moving barrels." "She's gonna roll down the hill." Laughter. Clara set down the barrel she was carrying, set it down, not dropped it, turned and looked at the road below with an expression she had borrowed from her grandmother. Perfectly blank, perfectly calm, the face of a woman waiting patiently for the world to run out of something to say. The boys moved on. She picked up the barrel and kept walking. There were adults too, of course. Adults were subtler, but not kinder. She heard what people said in the dry goods store, in the post office, in the spaces where she was near enough to catch words but far enough that they assumed she couldn't. That Whitmore widow. Lost her husband, and now she's losing her mind. Someone should tell her she's making a fool of herself. Pity, really. She heard Robert Jenks, who farmed the flatland just below her property, telling his hired man that it was embarrassing, watching a woman of her— there was a pause— size struggling up that hill with barrels. Somebody ought to help her pack and go to Denver. She heard Caldwell's hired man Silas telling people at the hardware store that the boss figured she'd be back to sell by midsummer. She filed all of it away, not to use for revenge. She was not a woman built for revenge, not in the dramatic sense, but to remember. Because she had learned early that the things people said when they thought you weren't listening were the most honest things about them and the most useful. The drilling and filling and positioning of the barrels took 3 weeks. She drilled drainage holes through the bottoms with a hand brace. Her palms blistered, healed, blistered again. She mixed her soil by hand in a wooden trough. Good compost from her kitchen and barn, sand from the creek, clay she dug from the east slope where the hillside leveled briefly. Martha had advised her on the proportions, and she followed Martha's instructions with the methodical attention she'd once given to Thomas's household accounts. The strawberry runners went in on the first warm morning in April. She planted each one herself, on her knees on the hillside, pressing the roots into the barrel soil with her thumbs, talking to them. She would admit this later, when she was comfortable enough with the success to admit the stranger parts of how it happened. Talking to them in the quiet voice she'd once used with her chickens and her garden, and, if she was being fully honest, with Thomas in the mine the morning he left, before she knew he wouldn't come back. "Come on now," she told them. "You can do this." The day she found the first white flowers, she was alone on the hillside, and she sat down right there in the dirt beside the barrel, and she cried. Not delicately, not quietly. She cried the way a person cries when they've been holding something for a very long time, and a small unexpected thing finally cracks the container, hard and ugly and full, with her head down and both hands pressed over her face, sitting on the rocky hillside she'd been told all her life was worthless. She cried for Thomas. She cried for the mine and the pine boxes and the company man who'd come with the $200 death payment, like that was a price for a man's life. She cried for the loneliness of the last 4 months, which had a specific texture she hadn't expected. Not the dramatic grief of loss, but the grinding, everyday kind. The absence of a voice in the kitchen in the morning. The absence of a second pair of boots by the door. She cried for all the mornings she'd gotten up anyway. And then she wiped her face with the back of her hand, looked at the flowers blooming white and clean against the gray Colorado hillside, and said out loud to nobody at all, "All right, Thomas. I think we've got something here." The first strawberries ripened in late May. They were small, intensely red. And when Clara pressed one between her tongue and the roof of her mouth, the sweetness was so concentrated, so unlike the watery, oversized strawberries she'd seen in the markets, that she stood perfectly still for a moment with her eyes closed. She brought a basket to Martha Collins. Martha ate 3 without speaking. Then she said, "Clara, these are extraordinary. The elevation," Clara said, "the drainage, the warmth in the barrels, the soil mixture I know what it is," Martha said. "I've been farming 40 years. I know what it is when something is right." She looked at the basket. "How many barrels are producing?" 6 right now. Should be 14 by next week." Martha looked up at her. "You need to sell these before anyone else gets the idea." The man from the hotel came on a Thursday. His name was Mr. Gerald Fitch, and he was a buyer for the Colorado Mountain Resort up near Leadville, where wealthy people from the East came to take the mountain air and spend money with the cheerful desperation of people who had a great deal of it. He had heard about Clara's strawberries from a woman in town, who had heard about them from Martha, who had begun talking about them with the quiet, strategic enthusiasm of a woman who understood exactly what she was doing. Fitch arrived in a good suit and a rented horse, and he looked at Clara's hillside the way people always looked at it, with the particular skepticism of someone seeing something that their experience told them shouldn't work. He looked at the barrels, at the plants, at the color of the fruit. Then he ate one strawberry, then another. He stood for a moment chewing with the focused, professional attention of a man who evaluated food for a living. Then he said, "Mrs. Whitmore, are you able to supply us on a regular basis?" Clara had rehearsed her answer. "I can supply you with 4 crates per week beginning the first week of June," she said. "More in July if the remaining barrels come in as I expect." "What price are you asking?" she told him. It was more than she'd told herself she'd ask. His eyebrows went up. "That's a bold price," he said. "It's the right price for the quality," she said. She met his eyes. "You won't find better fruit in the territory. You know it, and I know it." Fitch was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. A real smile, the kind that moves through a person's whole face. "No," he said. "I don't reckon I will." When Clara walked through Willow Creek the following Monday with the signed contract in her bag, she was the same woman she'd always been. Same body, same face, same clothes, same deliberate pace that the world had always seemed to find inconvenient. But something had shifted in the way she moved through the air. She stopped at the dry goods store for nails. Robert Jenks was standing near the door when she came out. He looked at her. "Heard you sold your berries," he said. "That's right. Good price?" "Good enough." He nodded slowly, the way men nodded when they were recalculating. "Huh," he said. Clara walked past him and out into the spring afternoon. She didn't smile until she was past the corner. Then she smiled all the way home. She was sitting on the hillside that evening when the sun dropped behind the western ridge and turned the sky above the valley into something pink and gold, and briefly, extravagantly beautiful, the way Colorado evenings sometimes were when nobody had particularly planned for them to be. The barrels sat around her in the dimming light, their dark shapes familiar to her now in the way things become familiar when you have put your hands on them every single day. She thought about Caldwell. She thought about the signed contract in her kitchen. She thought about her mother pressing seeds into dark soil with one thumb while a child watched. She thought about Thomas and the boots by the door, and the particular quality of a kitchen that held 2 people instead of 1. She thought about all the things people had said when they believed she couldn't hear them. The valley below her was settling into evening. Lamps coming on in windows. Horses moving in at dusk. The ordinary, persistent life of a place that had not yet noticed that something was changing. Clara looked at her barrels. At her fruit. At the hillside, everyone had told her was worthless. "All right," she said softly. She didn't say it to Thomas this time. She said it to herself. "All right, let's see what you've got." She would need more barrels. She would need to think about next season's planting before this season was over. She would need, and here was a thought that would have felt impossible 6 months ago, to hire someone to help her in the fall. The work was not finished. It was, if she was honest, barely started. But she was not the same woman who had stood at her kitchen door and told Harrison Caldwell no. She was something further along than that woman, something forged by months of getting up before sunrise and drilling holes with blistered hands and crying alone on a hillside over white flowers. Something that hadn't had a name when Thomas was alive. She was beginning to understand what it was now. She pulled her coat tighter against the evening cold. Below her, Willow Creek went about its business. Above her, the stars were beginning. And on the hillside that everyone had given up on, in barrels that everyone had called junk, something was growing that the valley hadn't counted on. Something that was going to matter more than anyone yet understood. The contract sat folded in Clara's kitchen drawer for exactly 4 days before Harrison Caldwell found out about it. She knew the moment she saw Silas riding up her road on a Wednesday morning, not knocking, just sitting on his horse at the edge of her property line, like a man who'd been sent to look at something his employer was considering purchasing. Clara was on the hillside. She watched him from up there. He watched her back. Neither of them waved. After a few minutes, he turned his horse around and rode back toward town, and Clara went back to checking her barrels, and that was the whole of it. Except it wasn't. Because 2 hours later, a boy from town came running up the road with a note folded in his hand. She opened it standing on her porch. "Mrs. Whitmore, I would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you at your earliest convenience regarding a matter of mutual benefit. H. Caldwell." Clara read it twice. Then she folded it exactly as it had been folded, set it on the kitchen table, and went back to work. She did not send a reply. She did not receive another note that day, or the next. But on Friday, Caldwell came himself. He did not bring Silas this time. He came alone, which told Clara something. That he wanted this conversation to feel personal rather than transactional, which meant he was going to try a different kind of pressure than money. She met him at the door. "Mr. Caldwell, Clara." He held his hat in both hands. A different posture than last time. Less certainty in it, more performance of reasonableness. "I heard about your arrangement with the hotel." "Did you?" "Congratulations are in order. It's a clever idea, what you've done up there." "Thank you." He waited, as if he expected her to add something. She didn't. "I wanted to talk to you," he said, "about next season." "What about it?" "I've been thinking." He turned his hat slowly in his hands. "What you've figured out up there, the barrel method, the drainage, the soil mixture, that's knowledge that could benefit the whole valley. I'd like to propose a partnership." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "What kind of partnership?" "I have the capital to scale this up significantly. More barrels, more plants, better distribution connections than you have on your own." He met her eyes. "Together we could supply not just one resort hotel, but a dozen. Denver markets, Kansas City even." "And what would I provide in this partnership?" "Your method, your expertise, and your land, of course." "And what percentage would I receive?" There was a pause that lasted exactly 1 beat too long. "I'd have to run the numbers," he said. "Run them now," Clara said. "Approximately." His jaw moved slightly. 30%. Clara nodded slowly, as if she were considering it. She wasn't considering it. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "let me make sure I understand your proposal. You want to use my method, on my land, with my expertise, and you would take 70% of the profit because you have capital." "The capital is significant." "I'm sure it is." Her voice was still even, still quiet. "My answer is no." His expression shifted. Not to anger, not yet, but to something harder underneath the pleasantness, something that had been there all along. "Clara," he said, and there was a different weight to her name this time. "You're a smart woman, but you're one bad season away from losing everything. I'm offering you stability. You're offering me 30 cents on my own dollar," she said. "I appreciate your time, Mr. Caldwell." She closed the door. She leaned against it and pressed both hands flat on the wood, same as before. Her hands were not shaking this time. That was new. She stood there for a moment, listening to his horse leave, and thought, he is going to make this harder now. That's what men like him do when you say no twice. They stop asking and start arranging. She was right. She just didn't know yet how many ways he knew how to arrange things. The first thing she noticed was the feed store. She had been buying her soil amendments from Miller's Feed on the south side of Main Street. Sand, compost material. The particular kind of aged wood chips that Martha had advised her to layer into the barrel bottoms for temperature regulation. She'd been buying on a small line of credit that old Earl Miller had extended to her with the gruff, matter-of-fact generosity of a man who judged people by whether they paid their bills. She went in on a Monday morning in June with her list, and Earl wouldn't meet her eyes. "Clara," he said, looking at the counter. "I'm sorry, I've had to close out your credit." She stopped. "Earl, what happened?" He was quiet for a moment, and the quiet itself was its own kind of answer. "Business decisions," he said. "Nothing personal." She looked at him, really looked at him, and she watched something move through his face that she recognized. Not malice, not even discomfort. It was the look of a man who had been placed in an impossible position and had chosen the option that protected him. "Caldwell," she said. It was not a question. Earl said nothing, which was answer enough. She bought what she could with cash, less than half of what she needed, and she walked out of Miller's Feed with her bag and her list, and her understanding of the situation, which had just gotten considerably more complicated. She went directly to Martha Collins. Martha listened to the whole thing without interrupting. This was one of the things Clara had come to depend on. Martha's particular stillness. The way she received information without rushing to fill it with reaction. When Clara finished, Martha poured more coffee into both cups and said, "He's cutting off your supplies." That's what it looks like. What else can he reach? Clara thought. The other feed stores in the county, the hardware, maybe the market contacts if he has relationships there. She set down her cup. He's not trying to buy me out anymore. He's trying to make me fail on my own. Martha nodded slowly. So we go around him. How? Denver. Clara looked at her. There's a supply company in Denver I've ordered from twice, Martha said. Mabel Greer's sister runs it with her husband. Good people. And they deliver to the rail depot in Pueblo. You could arrange for pickup. She paused. It'll cost more. I know. Can you manage it? Clara thought about the hotel contract. Thought about the numbers she'd run 3 times that week on Thomas's old ledger paper. I can manage it for 1 season, she said. Maybe 2 if the second planting comes in strong. Then we don't waste time, Martha said. She was already getting up, moving toward her writing desk with the purposeful energy of a woman who had been outmaneuvered before and knew exactly how to respond. I'll write the letter today. You take it to the depot tomorrow. Clara watched her for a moment. Martha, she said, why are you doing this? Martha didn't stop writing. Because I've been farming this valley for 40 years, she said, and I have watched men like Harrison Caldwell decide what this land is worth, and who gets to work it and who doesn't for every one of those 40 years. She dipped her pen. And I am tired of it. You're the first person in a long time who showed that hill something it hadn't been shown before. She looked up briefly. I don't intend to let that go to waste, because one man got his pride hurt. Clara swallowed hard. Thank you, she said. Stop thanking me, Martha said, and went back to her letter. Help me think of what else we need. The Denver supply connection solved the immediate problem, but it wasn't the last thing Caldwell tried. 2 weeks later, 3 of Clara's barrel frames were broken. She found them on a Tuesday morning. 2 on the upper section of the hillside, 1 near the south corner. The wooden supports she'd built to stabilize the barrels at angles snapped cleanly through. Not storm damage. The weather had been dry. The breaks were too clean, too deliberate. She stood looking at them for a long time. Then she went down to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Dale Briggs was a reasonable man. Not a brave one, but reasonable. And he listened to her with the careful attention of someone who was trying to work out which side of a situation required more of him. You're saying someone broke them deliberately, he said. I'm saying they didn't break on their own, Clara said. The wood is sound, the breaks are clean, and I don't have enemies in this valley except one, and we both know who that is. Briggs was quiet. Clara, he said finally, I can't go accusing Harrison Caldwell of property damage on the basis of... I'm not asking you to accuse anyone, she said. I'm asking you to note that damage occurred, for the record. He looked at her. She looked back. I'll note it, he said. Thank you, Sheriff. She went home and repaired the frames herself, in the dark, by lamplight, with her jaw set and her hands working steadily through wood and nail and rope. It took her until past midnight. When she was done, she sat on the hillside in the dark and looked at what she'd built, and said out loud to the night, You're going to have to do better than that. Then she went inside and slept for 5 hours and got up before sunrise and started again. The second thing that helped her, the thing she hadn't planned for, the thing that arrived the way most important things arrive, sideways and unannounced, was a man named Will Hatcher. Will Hatcher was 34 years old and had a played-out claim up on the North Ridge that had been producing nothing for 18 months. He was lean and quiet, with the careful movements of a man who'd learned to be economical with his energy because he'd spent too many years having less of it than the work required. He showed up at the bottom of her hill on a Thursday morning with his hat in his hand and a directness that she appreciated immediately. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, I heard what you're doing up here, with the barrels. Most people have heard, she said. I've got 8 acres on the North Ridge. Rocky hillside, bad drainage. Nobody's been able to farm it for 20 years. He met her eyes. I was wondering if you'd be willing to teach me what you know. Clara looked at him. She had been waiting for this, in a way, had known that if the barrel method worked, people would eventually come asking. but she hadn't known how she would feel when they did. Whether she'd be protective of what she'd figured out. Whether some part of her would want to hold it close, the way a person sometimes holds close the things that saved them, because letting go of them feels dangerous. She felt none of that. What she felt, standing on her hillside, looking at this tired, honest man with his hat in his hand, was something that surprised her with its clarity. She felt like her mother. "Come up," she said. "I'll show you what I know." Will Hatcher was not the only one. Within 3 weeks of her conversation with him, 2 more farmers came. Eliza Marsh, who had a rocky half-acre behind her house that had never produced anything, and old Pete Sorensen, whose east-facing hillside had broken him financially the previous year. They came quietly, not in a group, separately, each of them with that particular combination of pride and desperation that people carry when they need help and have had to overcome something to ask for it. Clara taught them all. She walked them through barrel selection, drainage drilling, soil mixing, root temperature management, fruit positioning for maximum sun exposure. She drew diagrams on scraps of paper with a pencil stub and handed them over without ceremony. She answered their questions with patience and specificity. She made them repeat back the most important things, the drainage ratios, the frost protection measures, until she was sure they had it. She did not charge them. Caldwell heard about this within a week. She knew, because Silas was back on the road below her property, and this time he didn't ride away quickly. He sat there for a good 10 minutes, watching the hillside where Clara and Will Hatcher were installing a new drainage frame, before turning and going. That evening, a different kind of pressure arrived. It came in the form of James Fowler, who owned the grain storage facility in Willow Creek, and who was, as far as Clara could tell, not a bad man, but an owned one. The kind who'd had his debts called in at exactly the right moment to make him useful to somebody else. Fowler came to her door after supper. "Clara," he said. He looked uncomfortable, genuinely uncomfortable, which she noted and filed. "I wanted to talk to you about the cooperative idea you've been developing. I haven't called it a cooperative. The method you're teaching to the other farmers." "What about it?" He shifted his weight. "I've been asked to let you know, by parties I'm not going to name, that there's concern about market impact. If you flood the territory with barrel-grown strawberries, you'll drive the price down, for everyone." Clara leaned in the doorframe. "Who grows strawberries in this valley right now?" she asked. "Well, nobody at scale. So the price of something that doesn't currently exist in volume cannot be driven down by me producing it." She kept her voice pleasant. "You can tell the parties you're not going to name that their math doesn't hold." Fowler's mouth worked for a moment. "Clara," he said, and now his voice dropped, and the discomfort in it got deeper. "I'm trying to do you a kindness by warning you. Caldwell is, he's talking to the hotel, to Fitch. He's telling them that your supply can't be reliable long term, that a single woman working alone can't guarantee the volume they need." Clara went very still. "He's trying to take the contract," she said. "He's trying to offer them something he says is more stable." Fowler looked at her steadily. "I'm sorry. I thought you should know." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you, James. I mean that." He nodded, looking relieved in the way of a man who'd managed to do a decent thing inside a complicated situation. "Watch yourself," he said, and left. Clara went inside. She stood in her kitchen in the lamplight, and she thought about Fitch, about the way he'd eaten that first strawberry, the look on his face, the smile that had moved through his whole expression. She thought about the contract in the drawer. Then she sat down and wrote a letter. It took her 3 drafts. The first was too defensive. She could hear it when she read it back, the anxious quality of a person trying to prove something. She burned that one in the stove. The second was too aggressive. It named Caldwell directly, and that felt like the wrong move, the move of someone reacting instead of leading. She burned that one too. The third was simply the truth, laid out in plain language. "Mr. Fitch, I write to update you on the expansion of my operation, which I believe is relevant to your continued interest in our arrangement. I am currently working with 3 additional farmers who are implementing the same barrel method on similar hillside properties. By next season, I anticipate our collective output will be sufficient to supply your resort at the volume you require, and to discuss supply agreements with additional buyers, should that be of interest to you. I remain committed to the quality and reliability you've come to expect. If any party has suggested otherwise, I invite you to visit and see the operation for yourself. Clara Whitmore. She read it twice. Then she sealed it and addressed it and took it to the depot herself the next morning before anyone in town was moving. She didn't know if it would work. She knew it was the right thing to do. While she waited for Fitch's response, the season kept moving. Because seasons don't wait for business disputes, don't pause for power struggles, don't hold themselves still while people figure out who they are. The hillside was producing strongly now. 14 barrels in full fruit, 4 more coming in. The color of the berries was that concentrated deep red that meant the sugar was high, the flavor intense, the kind of fruit that made people close their eyes when they ate it. Will Hatcher's first barrels were producing too. Less than Clara's, rougher at the edges, the way first season work always is. But producing, which meant it was possible, which meant it was real. Eliza Marsh came up on a Saturday with her 12-year-old daughter, and the girl ate a strawberry directly from one of Clara's barrels, and her face changed the way children's faces change when something is better than they expected. "Mama," the girl said, "these are the best thing I ever ate." Eliza looked at Clara. Clara looked back. There was something in that exchange that didn't have a name exactly. The recognition between 2 women of something that mattered, something that had been built out of difficulty and was now feeding a child who'd never expected to be fed by it. "Yes, they are," Eliza said quietly. That same afternoon, Caldwell made his move at the hotel. Clara didn't know the details until 2 days later, when Fitch himself rode out to her property. Not Silas, not a letter. Fitch in person, arriving on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced with his good suit and his professional face, and a directness that matched hers enough that she'd always respected him for it. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "Harrison Caldwell came to Leadville on Monday." "I know," she said. "Come up." She walked him up to the hillside, the same way she always walked visitors. Not rushing, not apologizing for her pace, letting the hill be what it was while they decided whether they were willing to climb it. She let him see the barrels first. She let him see Will Hatcher's operation on the far side of the ridge, visible from where they stood as a pattern of dark shapes against the pale rock. She let him see Eliza Marsh's property below, where the first small barrel frames were going in. She didn't say anything for a while. Then Fitch said, "He offered us lower prices." "I know. And a guarantee of volume that he says you can't provide." "He doesn't have the method," Clara said. "He doesn't have the understanding of the land. He has money, and he has connections, and he will get the appearance of this right. But the fruit won't be the same." She turned to face him. "You ate my strawberries, Mr. Fitch. You know what they taste like. You also know what a flat field strawberry from an irrigated farm tastes like." "I do," he said. "So you know the difference isn't about volume," she said. "It's about what the land is doing to the fruit, the elevation, the drainage, the temperature." She gestured across the hillside. "That's not something you can copy with money. You have to understand it first." Fitch was quiet. The way he was quiet told her he'd already made his decision. She'd learned to read people's silences better since Thomas died. There was more writing on it when you were alone, the ability to know what a silence meant before it became words. "He offered 40% below your price," Fitch said. "And in 2 years, when the quality isn't there and the supply is inconsistent, what will that 40% have cost you in reputation?" Fitch almost smiled. "You're not much like most of the suppliers I deal with," he said. "No," Clara agreed. "I reckon I'm not." He extended his hand. "I'll want to meet the other farmers," he said. "If this is going to be the supply cooperative you described in your letter." "Come Saturday," she said. "I'll have them here." She shook his hand. Her grip was firm, the way her father had taught her. Not aggressive, not deferential, just present, just equal. Fitch rode back toward Leadville. Clara stood on the hillside and breathed the high Colorado air and let herself, for just a moment, feel the full weight of what had just happened. Not victory. Not yet. But something real. Something that had been built. She thought about Caldwell sitting in that hotel in Leadville, making his pitch, certain of himself the way men like him were always certain of themselves. Certain that she would eventually run out of something. Money, will, credit, luck. And that when she did, the thing she'd built would come to him cheaply, the way things always came to men who waited. She thought about what he didn't know yet. What she'd built wasn't one woman's project anymore. It was Will Hatcher's North Ridge. It was Eliza Marsh's half-acre. It was Pete Sorensen's east-facing hillside. It was Martha Collins's 40 years of knowing this land and her willingness to bet on a woman in barrels when nobody else would. It was bigger than Caldwell had counted on. It was bigger than Clara had even planned for. On Saturday, the farmers gathered on her hillside for the first time, 4 of them now, counting Clara, standing among the barrels in the afternoon light, with Fitch moving among them asking questions and eating strawberries and scribbling in his notebook. Clara watched it happen, watched Will Hatcher explaining his drainage method. Her method, now his too, passed on in the way that useful knowledge gets passed, person to person, hand to hand. Watched Eliza Marsh describe the first planting she'd done the previous week with the careful pride of a woman who'd done something new and was still slightly surprised it had worked. Watched Pete Sorensen, who was not a man who showed much, listening to Fitch with the focused attention of someone who'd given up on believing good things were available to him and was now reconsidering. She watched all of it, and she thought, this is what he couldn't buy. Not the land, not the method, not the barrels. This specific gathering of people who had been told their land was worthless and were now standing on it together, producing something that a man from a wealthy hotel was writing in his notebook with increasing interest. This was what Caldwell couldn't copy, because it wasn't about money or capital or scale. It was about a woman who'd refused to accept what she'd been told her land was, and who had refused, quietly, stubbornly, entirely, to keep that knowledge to herself. Fitch left with commitments from all 4 farmers for next season. He shook hands with each of them. When he got to Clara last, he held her hand a moment longer than the others. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I want you to know, the reason I came out here myself instead of sending a letter was because I wanted to see what you'd built. And? You built something that doesn't depend on you." He looked across the hillside, at the other farmers, at the barrels, at the ordinary and extraordinary fact of it. Most people who have a good idea, they hold it tight. They're afraid if they let it go, they'll lose it. He looked back at her. You let it go. Clara thought about her mother pressing seeds into dark soil with her thumb. About a child watching. About knowledge passing from one pair of hands to the next. "It wasn't mine to keep," she said. Fitch nodded slowly. "No," he said. "I reckon it wasn't." He rode away. The farmers stood on the hillside together in the quiet after he left, and nobody said much for a moment, because sometimes the right response to something important is to be still with it for a little while before you start finding words. Then Will Hatcher said, "Clara, what do we call ourselves?" She looked at him. Then she looked at the others. Then she looked at the barrels, at the fruit, at the rocky hillside that generations of people had called worthless, that had turned out to be waiting for nothing more complicated than someone willing to understand what it already was. "Farmers," she said. Will almost smiled. "That's it?" "That's enough," Clara said. She turned back to her barrels. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. But for the first time since Thomas died, for the first time in longer than that, if she was being fully honest, she was not doing it alone. And that, she thought, as she pressed her hands into the warm barrel soil and the afternoon light moved long across the Colorado hillside, was something she had not known she needed until she had it. Something she did not intend to let go of. The meeting on the hillside changed things in ways Clara hadn't fully anticipated. She had expected resistance. She had expected Caldwell to push harder. What she had not expected was how quickly the news traveled and how differently different people received it. By Monday morning, 3 days after Fitch rode away with his notebook full of commitments, Clara walked into Willow Creek for supplies and felt the shift before anyone said a word to her. It was in the way people looked, not the dismissive glance she'd carried for years like a familiar weight, but something more complicated. Some people met her eyes too quickly, with the overcompensating brightness of those who'd been saying things they now regretted. Some looked away altogether, which told her even more. And some, a smaller number, but real, simply nodded, the plain, level nod of acknowledgement that one person gives another when something has been proved, and there is no more argument to be had. She bought her nails. She bought her seed oil. She stopped at the post office. Agnes Perkins, who ran the post office and knew everything that happened in Willow Creek approximately 48 hours before it happened to anyone else, handed Clara her mail with the particular expression of a woman who had information and was deciding how much of it to release. "Heard you had a visitor from Leadville," Agnes said. "I did. Heard it went well." It did. Agnes slid one more envelope across the counter. Not mail, Clara saw, but something that had been left there for her to pick up. Heavy cream paper. No stamp. She opened it in the street. It was from Caldwell. Not a note this time. A formal letter, written in the careful hand of a man who had dictated it to someone else and then signed it himself at the bottom. "Mrs. Whitmore, I have become aware of your recent arrangements with the Colorado Mountain Resort and the expanded operation you are developing with other farmers in the area. I write to inform you that I intend to pursue my own barrel-growing operation on my lower fields, drawing on the general agricultural principles your experiment has demonstrated. I wish you no ill will, but I want you to understand clearly that the market you have identified will not remain yours alone. Competition is the nature of enterprise. Harrison Caldwell." Clara read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and walked home. She gave herself exactly the length of that walk to feel what she felt, which was not fear, not exactly, and not anger either, but something colder and more focused than either of those things. The feeling of a person who has been told, plainly and without pretense, that someone intends to come after what they've built. By the time she got home, the feeling had settled into something she recognized: clarity. She went directly to Martha's house. Martha was in her garden when Clara arrived, moving through it with that efficient purposefulness that made her look 10 years younger when she was working. She looked up when Clara came through the gate and read her face immediately. "What happened?" Clara handed her the letter. Martha read it without speaking. Her expression didn't change much. The slight tightening around the eyes, the compression of her lips that Clara had come to understand meant she was sorting through things rapidly and without sentiment. "He's going to copy you," Martha said. "He's going to try." Can he? The basic structure, yes. Anyone can build barrels with drainage holes and fill them with soil. That part isn't secret. Clara sat down on Martha's porch step. But the soil ratios, the positioning relative to drainage patterns, the specific variety combinations that work at this elevation, that takes seasons to understand. You don't get it right by reading about it. Martha handed the letter back. "So he'll have a first season that looks right from the outside and produces mediocre fruit," she said. "That's what I think. And by the time anyone figures out the difference, he'll have sold to buyers who don't know what good tastes like yet." Clara nodded slowly. Martha sat down beside her on the step. "Then we need to make sure the buyers know before he gets to them," she said. "How?" "You already have Fitch. Fitch talks to other buyers. That's how this business works. One person with credibility tells another person, and the standard gets set before the imitation arrives." Martha looked at her directly. "You need to get to the Denver market contact before Caldwell does. Get your fruit in front of them. Let them taste it first." "I don't have a Denver contact." "I do," Martha said simply. Clara stared at her. Martha had the expression of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this moment to produce something she'd been holding in reserve. "Frances Holt," she said. "She runs procurement for 3 of the largest hotel dining rooms in Denver. I knew her husband 20 years ago. She's a fair woman, and she knows quality." She stood up. "I'll write her today. But Clara, you need to move fast. Caldwell already has a head start on contacts you haven't made yet. Clara stood too. How fast? 2 weeks, Martha said. Maybe less. Clara went home and did not sleep much that night. She lay in the dark and ran calculations. What she had, what she needed, what she could afford to spend, and what she couldn't. She thought about the letter in her coat pocket and what it meant in plain terms. That Caldwell had stopped trying to buy her and had started trying to erase her. He was going to flood the market with an inferior product and let buyers who didn't know better choose based on price. And by the time the difference became clear, Clara's operation would be one of several, rather than the original, and the story of how it started would get muddied in the way that stories get muddied when powerful people decide the original version doesn't serve them. She would not let that happen. She got up before 4 in the morning and started writing her own letters to Fitch, requesting that he provide a written endorsement of the quality and consistency of her supply. To Will Hatcher and Eliza Marsh and Pete Sorensen, asking them to meet on the hillside Thursday morning because there was something they needed to decide together. And one to a woman she'd never met, Frances Holt of Denver, drafted and redrafted until it said exactly what she meant without a single extra word. She sealed all of them before sunrise. When the farmers gathered on Thursday, Clara laid it out without preamble. Caldwell is moving, she said. He's building his own barrel operation. He's going after the same buyers. The silence that followed had different qualities in different people. Will Hatcher's jaw tightened. Eliza Marsh looked at her hands, then looked up with that particular steadiness she had. A woman who'd been through enough that she didn't panic, she just recalibrated. Pete Sorensen made a sound that was not quite a word. Can he do what we're doing? Will asked. He can do a version of it, Clara said. He has the money to build fast, buy plants, look credible quickly. What he doesn't have is the understanding of why it works. But buyers who haven't tasted the difference won't know that yet. So what do we do? Eliza asked. We get our fruit in front of every serious buyer in the territory before he does. Clara looked at each of them. And we document what we've built. Every method, every result, every season's data. So that when someone asks who developed this and how, there's no question. That's a lot of work, Pete said. Yes, Clara agreed. It is. Pete looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. That was Pete Sorensen's version of enthusiasm. Clara took it as such. The next 11 days were the hardest stretch since the first spring. Clara worked the hillside through the days and wrote records and letters through the evenings and slept in the narrow band of hours between midnight and 4. She drove herself with the specific, frightening energy of someone who knows that a thing they've built is in danger and that no one else is going to save it for them. Will Hatcher came up the hill one evening without being asked and worked beside her until dark, without much conversation. He did that twice more that week. She didn't thank him for it because he hadn't done it for thanks, and they both understood that. Eliza's 12-year-old daughter started coming on afternoons after school, picking fruit with the careful attention Clara had shown her, handling the berries the way you handle something valuable, which they were. The response from Frances Holt arrived on a Friday. Clara opened it at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her. Mrs. Whitmore, Martha Collins has spoken highly of your methods and your character for many years, which carries considerable weight with me. I would be interested in receiving a sample shipment and discussing terms. If the fruit is as described, I believe we can do business. Frances Holt. Clara set the letter down. She pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed. Then she got up and went to the hillside and picked the best crate of strawberries she had ever packed, choosing each berry individually, setting aside anything that was less than perfect, wrapping the crate in the clean cotton she'd bought specifically for this, packing it in ice from the creek and sawdust from the mill. She drove it to the Pueblo Depot herself the next morning, leaving before dawn. She did not tell anyone except Martha. She did not know if it would be enough. She drove home in the afternoon through the long Colorado light and told herself, with the specific discipline of a person who has learned that anxiety is only useful when it produces action and useless in every other form, that she had done what she could do and she would wait to see what it produced. What it produced arrived 12 days later. Not a letter this time. Frances Holt herself, on a Tuesday afternoon, arriving in Willow Creek on the Denver stage, with a carpet bag and an expression of professional assessment that Clara recognized immediately as the look of a woman who had made a career out of knowing good from mediocre and was not easily impressed. She was approximately 60, small and sharp-eyed, with gray hair pinned with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who had better things to think about than her hair. She introduced herself to Clara with a handshake that matched Martha's description exactly. Firm, direct, businesslike, without being cold. "I ate your strawberries on the train," she said. "I shared them with the woman sitting across from me, who I have never met before and will likely never see again." She said, and I am quoting directly, "Good Lord, where did you get these?" Clara almost smiled. "Come up the hill," she said. Frances Holt climbed the hillside without complaint, without slowing, without any of the performative difficulty that some visitors used to remind Clara that the terrain was inconvenient. She simply climbed it, looking at everything with that focused professional eye, asking questions in short, precise bursts that Clara answered with matching brevity. "How many producing barrels?" 18 now, projecting 26 by end of season. "Consistency of size?" "Better than flat field fruit because we control the soil moisture precisely." "Shelf life?" 48 hours in proper packing, more than enough for the Denver rail connection. Frances looked at the operation for a long time without speaking. She looked at Will Hatcher's ridge, which was visible from where they stood. She looked at the valley below. Then she turned to Clara. "I'm going to be direct with you," she said. "Harrison Caldwell's man came to see me in Denver last week." Clara kept her expression steady. "What did he offer?" "Lower price, promises of higher volume." Frances's voice was entirely neutral, which meant she was choosing her words carefully. "He was very confident." "I imagine he was. He also told me that your operation was a one-woman hobbyist farm that had gotten lucky with one hotel contract and wasn't scalable." Frances looked at her directly. "I'm looking at 4 farms operating the same method. That doesn't look like luck or hobbyism to me." "No," Clara said. "It isn't. His fruit isn't ready yet. He showed me projections, not product." Frances paused. "Yours is ready. I ate it on the train." Clara waited. "I want a supply contract," Frances said. "Larger than what you have with Fitch. I want first buyer rights on your cooperative's production for the Denver market. And I want the arrangement documented, so that when Mr. Caldwell arrives with his product in 6 months, there's no ambiguity about who is supplying whom." Clara looked at her. She was aware, in a way that felt almost physical, of the size of the moment, of the distance between this and the morning. She'd stood at her kitchen door and turned down $200 for 6 acres of rock. Of how many mornings of getting up before sunrise lived in the space between those 2 moments. "I'll need to discuss terms with the other farmers," Clara said. "This isn't only my operation." Something moved through Frances Holt's expression. Something that Clara thought might have been respect, though it came and went quickly in the way that respect does in people who have learned to be cautious about showing it. "Of course," Frances said. "That's exactly the right answer." They shook hands. That evening, Clara called the farmers together again. She laid out the offer, the terms, the volumes, the pricing, the first buyer arrangement. She was clear about what it meant and what it required. "More production," Will said. "More barrels, more plants, more labor." Clara nodded. "Yes." "I can expand," Eliza said quietly. "If I have guaranteed buyers, I can expand." Pete Sorensen was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Is she good for it, this Holt woman?" "Martha vouches for her," Clara said. "And she came herself instead of sending an agent. That tells you something." Pete nodded once. They voted. It wasn't a formal vote. They didn't have that kind of structure yet, though Clara was beginning to think they needed to build it. But each of them said yes or said nothing, and nobody said no, and that was enough. What happened next was something none of them had fully planned for, and it arrived the way crises always arrive, in the middle of everything else, on an ordinary day, without any warning that it was coming. It was a Thursday morning in late July. Clara was on the hillside when she heard the sound. Not dramatic, not loud, just the low, unmistakable sound of someone moving through her property below with more than casual intention. She stood up and looked. It was Silas. Not at the road this time. On her land. Walking the lower section of the hillside with a measuring tape and a notebook. Clara came down the hill. She walked directly to him without hurrying, which took more self-control than she would admit to anyone. "Silas," she said, "you're on my property." He stopped, had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Mr. Caldwell sent me to get some measurements," he said, "of my land. Of the terrain in this area generally, the hillside features. On my land," Clara repeated. Silas's jaw moved. He said he needed to understand the drainage patterns for his own operation. "His own operation is a quarter-mile west," Clara said. "This is my property. You're going to fold that measuring tape, and you're going to walk back to the road, and you're going to tell Mr. Caldwell that if he sends anyone onto my land without my permission again, I will go to Sheriff Briggs, and this time I will not be asking him to simply make a note." Silas looked at her. He was a man who had spent years working for someone who didn't get told no very often, and the discomfort of being in a position where no was the only available answer showed clearly in his face. He folded the measuring tape. He walked to the road. Clara watched him go with her arms at her sides and her breathing deliberate and even, and she thought, he is getting more desperate. She was right. The measuring tape incident was a Thursday. By Saturday, she heard from Robert Jenks, who had become, in the quiet way of a man who reads which direction things are going, someone who kept Clara informed of valley gossip without being directly asked, that Caldwell had gone to the county land office. "What for?" Clara asked. Robert hesitated. He was a man who delivered information reluctantly, as if each piece of it was something he'd paid for. "Water rights," he said. Clara felt something go cold and fast through her chest. "What about water rights?" "He's filed a claim," Robert said, "on the creek drainage that runs through the lower section of your property. Says it's been in dispute since your father's time." The creek drainage. Clara knew the one. A shallow seasonal drainage that ran through the southeast corner of her land, carrying snowmelt down from the ridge in spring. She'd never thought much about it. It wasn't the source of her irrigation, which she managed through barrels and careful rain collection. But it fed the hillside moisture levels in ways that were harder to quantify. And if Caldwell had found a legal lever in a contested water claim, he didn't need to damage her barrels or cut off her supplies. He could simply make the land legally complicated. "When did he file?" she asked. "Monday," Robert said. Clara did the math. Monday was the day after she'd met with Francis Holt on the hillside. The same day the four farmers had agreed to the Denver contract. He had been watching. He had seen Francis Holt arrive. He had known within hours what it meant, and he had gone straight to the county land office first thing Monday morning. She went inside and stood in her kitchen for a long moment. She was not a woman who scared easily. She had established that, she thought, over the course of this year, established it for herself in the most reliable way possible, which was by being scared and continuing anyway. But this was different from broken barrel frames and closed credit lines. This was her land. This was the specific thing they could take from her if they made the legal ground uncertain enough. She picked up her coat. She went to find the only lawyer in Willow Creek. His name was Edward Crane, and he operated out of a small office above the dry goods store with the self-contained competence of a man who had seen most of what human beings did to each other over property and was no longer surprised by any of it. He was perhaps 50. With reading glasses he was constantly losing and finding, and he listened to Clara's situation with his hands folded and his expression professionally careful. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father's original deed. Do you have it?" "Yes." "Does it specify water rights on the southeast drainage?" "I don't know," Clara said. "I'd need to look." "Find it tonight," Crane said. "Bring it to me tomorrow morning. And Clara," he looked at her over his glasses, "don't talk to Caldwell about this directly. Don't talk to Silas. Don't talk to anyone you're not sure of. Let me find out what he actually filed before we decide what it means. She was at his office at 7 the next morning with her father's deed in her hand. Crane spread it on his desk and read it with the focused attention of a man looking for something specific. Clara sat across from him and held herself still. The clock on his wall ticked. Outside, Willow Creek went about its morning business, entirely unaware that in this small office above the dry goods store, something was happening that would matter more than most of what happened in the street below. Crane looked up. "The water rights on the southeast drainage are included in your deed," he said, explicitly. "Your father's original purchase included them. There is no dispute unless Caldwell is claiming the deed itself is fraudulent." He paused. "Is there any reason he might claim that?" "No," Clara said. "Then his filing is an attempt to create uncertainty where there isn't any," Crane said. "It's not unheard of. File a claim. Force the other party to spend time and money defending what they already own, hope they can't afford the fight." He folded his glasses. "It's a bully's move." "Can you answer it?" "I can have a response filed by end of week that will make it very clear his claim has no legal basis." He looked at her steadily. It won't be free." "I know. Can you manage it?" Clara thought about Francis Holt's contract, which was not yet signed, but was as close to signed as a handshake and a train ride constituted. She thought about the Denver market. She thought about next season's production. "I can manage it," she said. "All right." Crane put his glasses back on. "Then let me get to work." Clara walked out of his office into the morning street. She stood there for a moment, and she let herself feel it. The full weight of what she was carrying, the legal challenge, the supply competition, the expanded contract she had to fill, the 4 farmers depending on decisions she made, the memory of Thomas in everything she touched. She let herself feel it because she had learned that was important, that pretending it wasn't heavy didn't make it lighter. Then she squared her shoulders. Then she walked to the hardware store and bought more nails, because the barrels needed new support frames on the upper section, and that wasn't going to wait for Caldwell's lawyers. The legal response Crane filed landed on Thursday. By Friday, Caldwell's water rights claim was withdrawn. Clara heard about it from Agnes Perkins at the post office, who told her with the restrained satisfaction of a woman who had been rooting for Clara from the beginning and was too professional to show it openly. "Withdrew the claim this morning," Agnes said. "I heard," Clara said. "Reckon he thought it would be easier than it was." "I reckon he did." Agnes handed her the mail with something in her expression that took Clara a moment to identify. Pride. Not personal pride. The pride of a woman who had watched something happen in her town that she hadn't expected to see. Clara walked home with her mail and her nails, and the particular exhaustion of someone who has fought a battle on 3 fronts simultaneously and won all 3 through sheer refusal to stop. But she was not celebrating. She was calculating. Because the water rights claim told her something important about where Caldwell was. He had moved from strategy to reaction. He was no longer planning. He was responding to her. That meant she had more initiative than she'd realized, and it meant he was going to do something else. Men like Harrison Caldwell did not give up. They recalibrated. They found the angle you hadn't covered, and they came at it with the particular precision of someone who has resources and time, and the fundamental belief that they cannot ultimately be denied. She sat on the hillside that evening and thought about what she hadn't covered. The barrels were solid. The contract moving. The legal challenge was answered. The supply lines were secure. What was she missing? She thought about it for a long time, watching the sky change above the valley. Then the answer came to her. Not what she was missing. Who? There was one person in this story who hadn't been accounted for yet. One person who existed at the edge of everything that had happened, who had watched all of it and formed an opinion and hadn't yet decided what to do with it. Robert Jenks. Robert Jenks, who farmed the flatland just below her property. Robert Jenks, who had told his high... It was embarrassing watching a woman her size struggle up that hill. Robert Jenks, who had also, quietly, without fanfare, without being asked, kept her informed of what Caldwell was doing. Robert Jenks, who owned 40 flat acres below her hillside. 40 acres that had direct road access to the Pueblo Depot. 40 acres through which, if she was going to scale up the way Francis Holt's contract required, she was going to need transport access that didn't require driving her own wagon across the long way around. She had not thought about it until now. She thought about it hard. The next morning, she knocked on Robert Jenks's door. He answered it with the expression of a man who had been halfway expecting this and wasn't sure whether to be relieved or alarmed. "Clara," he said. "Robert, can I come in?" He stepped back. She sat at his kitchen table, a kitchen that was not so different from hers, the same rough frontier practicality, the same sense of a house that had been managed by one person for too long without the balance of two. And she put her cards on the table without preamble. "I need road access through your property," she said, "for transport to the depot. I'm willing to pay for it, or trade it for something useful to you, or negotiate whatever arrangement makes sense. But I want to ask you directly before I look for other options." Robert Jenks looked at his coffee cup. "Caldwell came to me," he said. Clara kept her face even. "When?" "Last week, before the water rights business." "What did he offer?" "To buy my land." Robert's voice was flat. "Good price. Better than market." "And?" "And he told me that if I sold to him, he'd have direct road access to the depot himself, bypassing you completely." He looked up. He was very clear about why he wanted it. Clara looked at him. "What did you say?" Robert Jenks was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I told him I'd think about it." Silence in the kitchen. "And have you?" Clara asked. He looked at her across the table. Really looked at her, the way people rarely do, with the specific attention of someone trying to see a thing accurately, rather than through the filter of what they've already decided. "I told my hired man it was embarrassing," he said, "watching you on that hill." "I know, I heard you." He flinched slightly. "I was wrong," he said. Clara waited. "I've been watching what you've done," he said. "The hill, the barrels, the contracts, the other farmers, the way you handled Caldwell." Something moved in his face. "My wife would have liked you. She was that kind of woman. She didn't let things stay the way they were just because that's how they'd been." Clara was quiet. "Road access," Robert said. "You can have it. I don't want payment." He held up a hand before she could respond. "But I want in. If there's a cooperative being built here, I want a place in it." Clara looked at him. "You have flat land," she said. "The barrel method works on rocky hillside. Flat land produces different—" "I don't want to grow strawberries," Robert said. "I want to grow what fits my land, and I want to sell it through the same network you're building." He met her eyes. "You've figured out something about this valley that none of us saw. I'd rather be part of that than sell my land to a man who wants to use it against you." Clara was quiet for a long moment. "If you're in," she said finally, "you follow the same rules as everyone else. We make decisions together. No one gets a bigger say because they have more land or longer history." "Agreed." "And you work," she said. "Not direct people. Work." Robert Jenks almost smiled. "My wife said the same thing to me," he said. "First day we were married." Clara stood up. She extended her hand. He shook it. And just like that, the thing Caldwell had tried to use against her, Robert Jenks's land, Robert Jenks's road access, Robert Jenks's undecided loyalty, became the newest piece of what she was building. She walked home through the afternoon with 5 farmers in her cooperative instead of 4, and road access to the depot. She hadn't had that morning, and the particular feeling of a woman who has learned, over the course of a very hard year, that the obstacles placed in your way are sometimes the thing that shows you what you still need to build. She was tired. She was also, she realized, deeply, quietly, in the place where real things happen before you find words for them, more alive than she had been in years, maybe ever. She climbed her hillside. Her barrels were there in the late afternoon light, full of fruit, tended by hands other than hers now too, part of something larger than what she'd started alone with a blistered palm and a pencil stub, and a memory of her mother pressing seeds into dark soil. She checked the south barrel, the one that had produced the first white flowers. the one she thought of as the first because it was. Fruit. Dark red. Perfect. She picked one and ate it standing there on the hillside. The sweetness hit her the way it always did. Concentrated, clean. The taste of something that had been grown exactly right. She closed her eyes for just a second. Somewhere below, Caldwell was recalibrating. She knew it. She could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives. Not the specific shape of it yet, but the pressure change, the stillness that precedes something moving. She opened her eyes. She looked at the valley. Whatever he was planning, she thought, let him plan it. She would be ready. She had learned something about herself this year that she hadn't known before, and it was this. She was better under pressure than she was at rest. She was sharper when something was at stake. She was more herself when the ground was difficult. She had a rocky hill for a farm, and she had been told all her life that was a limitation. It turned out it was a description. The storm came on a Friday. Not the storm Clara had been expecting. Not the human storm. Not the next move from Caldwell that she'd been bracing for every morning when she woke up, and every evening when she checked her barrels. This was weather. Real weather. The kind that the old-timers in Willow Creek talked about with the respectful brevity of people who had learned not to underestimate what came down from the mountains when it decided to move. She felt it before she saw it. Thursday evening, the air changed. That particular drop in pressure that animals feel before people do. That makes horses restless and dogs pace, and something in the back of a person's skull go quiet and alert at the same time. Martha felt it too. She came by Thursday afternoon, which was unusual for Martha, who was not a woman who made social visits without purpose. "Weather coming?" Martha said, standing at Clara's door. "I know. Bad one. I've seen that sky before." Martha looked at the horizon. Not at Clara, at the horizon, with the concentrated attention of someone reading something. 1871. Before you came back to the valley. Storm came through in August, hit the flat fields hard, flooded most of the lower farms. Clara's mind was already moving. "The barrels," she said. "They're elevated," Martha said. "That's in your favor. But the frames, if the wind gets under them." "I need to secure the frames," Clara said. "Tonight," Martha said. "Not tomorrow morning. Tonight." Clara was already reaching for her coat. She worked until midnight. Will Hatcher arrived at 9 without being called, the same way he'd been arriving all season when something needed doing. Quietly, practically, with the specific usefulness of a man who understood that some situations don't require conversation. He brought rope and additional stakes, and they worked together in the dark, reinforcing every frame on Clara's hillside, checking every barrel, packing stones around the base of anything that looked like it might shift under wind pressure. Eliza Marsh's husband came at 10, a quiet man named Samuel, who Clara had spoken to perhaps 3 times, but who showed up with tools and asked where he was needed without preamble. By midnight, everything that could be secured was secured. Clara stood on the hillside in the dark and looked at what they'd done. "Go home," she told Will and Samuel. "Get some sleep. Check your own operations at first light." Will looked at her. "What about you?" "I'll sleep," she said. "I'll be up at 4. He didn't argue. He knew better by now. The storm hit at 2 in the morning. Clara was awake when it arrived, had been lying in bed listening to the wind build with the alert stillness of someone waiting for something they've been told is coming. When the first real gust hit the house, she was already sitting up. When the rain started, she was already dressed. She did not go to the hillside. She had done what she could do, and standing on a hillside in a violent August storm was not something she could do and survive with her wits intact. She sat at the kitchen table instead with a lamp and Thomas's ledger and went through her records, because there was nothing else useful she could do, and because staying busy was the only way she knew to manage the particular terror of waiting, while something you've built is out there in the dark, being tested by something you can't control. The storm lasted 6 hours. By 8 in the morning, it had moved east, and the valley was the particular washed silence of a place that has just been through something. Clara went up the hillside. She stood at the top and looked, 12 of her 18 producing barrels were intact and undamaged. The frames she and Will had reinforced held. 3 barrels had shifted in the wind. Frames loosened, positions changed, but the barrels themselves unbroken and the plants damaged but not destroyed. 3 had come down entirely. She stood there and took inventory with the methodical calm of a woman who had learned to count what remained before she mourned what was lost. 12 intact, 3 repairable, 3 lost. It was not as bad as it could have been. Then she looked at the valley below. The flat fields, Caldwell's fields, the Jenks lower acreage that Robert had kept in traditional crops while building his cooperative membership, the other flat farms along the creek, were flooded. Standing water across the low ground, crops flattened, the particular devastation of farmland that has been overwhelmed by water, it couldn't drain fast enough. She saw it and felt something complicated. Not satisfaction, never satisfaction at another person's loss, but something clarifying. The understanding, in visual and immediate terms, of why the hillside had always been worth something that the flat-field farmers couldn't see. The elevation, the drainage, the rock base that let water move through and away instead of sitting. The thing everyone had called a defect was the thing that had saved her. She went down to check on Will's operation first, then Eliza's, then Pete's. She found each of them on their properties doing what she had done, standing in the aftermath, taking inventory, counting what remained. Will had lost 2 barrels. Eliza had lost 1. Pete, whose north-facing ridge had been partially sheltered by the terrain, had lost none. Robert Jenks met her at the road between his property and hers. His face told her everything before he spoke. "Lower 40 is gone," he said. His voice was flat with the particular flatness of a man holding something very heavy, very still. "Corn's down, all of it, maybe 2/3 of the harvest." Clara looked at him. "Come up the hill," she said. He stood there for a moment, and she saw something move through him, the pride of a man who had always worked his own land his own way, encountering the necessity of leaning on something outside himself. He came up the hill. She showed him what had survived. She showed him the intact barrels, the secured frames, the fruit that was damaged in places but still there, still producing, still present in a way that the flat fields were not. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I need to plant more." "Yes," Clara said. "Not corn, not wheat." He looked at the barrels. "This. Whatever version of this works on my land." "Your land is different," Clara said. "Flat field, different soil conditions. We'd have to think about what varieties work, how to position for drainage. Will you help me figure it out?" She looked at him. A year ago, Robert Jenks had told his hired man it was embarrassing watching her struggle up the hill. A year ago, she had heard that and filed it away. "Yes," she said. "I'll help you figure it out." The storm damage brought something Clara hadn't anticipated. The valley's attention, but differently than before. Before, the attention had been the kind that comes with skepticism. People watching to see someone fail, or watching to understand something strange, or watching because human beings watch things that are outside the expected order. The attention after the storm was different. It was the attention of people who had lost something and were looking, perhaps for the first time with genuine openness, at what had survived and why. She heard about it first from Agnes at the post office, who told her that 3 farmers from the eastern edge of the valley had been asking around about the barrel method. Then from Martha, who said that 2 women she knew from the church guild had come to her asking whether Clara was the person to speak to about hillside farming. Then from Will, who told her with the faint surprise of a man still adjusting to how things had changed, that a farmer named Cooper from the next county over had ridden in specifically to look at the cooperative's operation and had stayed for 2 hours asking questions. "He wants in," Will said. "He's not in our valley," Clara said. "No, but he's got the same kind of hillside we do. Rocky, north-facing, nobody's been able to farm it." Will looked at her carefully. He asked if the method could work somewhere else. Clara thought about that. "Did you tell him yes?" "I told him I didn't know," Will said. "I told him he'd have to ask you." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Invite him to come back," she said. I'll talk to him." The visit from the Cooper County farmer was on a Wednesday, and it went exactly as Will had described. A man with hard land and honest desperation, and the kind of directness that comes from running out of other options. His name was David Alderman, and he had 40 acres of rocky hillside in Cooper County that had broken 2 previous owners and was well on its way to breaking him. Clara walked him through everything. Not just the mechanics, the barrel construction, the soil ratios, the drainage design, but the thinking behind it. Why each decision had been made, what problems each solution was solving. How to read the land before you decided where to put anything. Alderman listened with his whole body, the way people listen when they're not just gathering information but rebuilding hope in real time. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Mrs. Whitmore, did anybody help you figure this out, or did you do it yourself?" "My mother taught me something about how plants grow," Clara said. "Martha Collins understood the soil. I put it together." "Nobody else?" "Nobody else." He shook his head slowly. "And Caldwell's been trying to stop you this whole time." "He's been trying to compete," Clara said carefully. "That's different from stopping." Alderman looked at her. "Is it?" "It is," she said. "Stopping would mean it was over. Competing means he knows he can't stop it." Something changed in Alderman's face at that. "Can I bring 2 other farmers from my county to see your operation?" he said. "Men with the same kind of land I have." "Yes," Clara said. "But I want something in return." "What?" "When you go home and build your operation," she said, "and it works. And it will work, if you do it right. I want you to teach the next person who comes asking, the way I'm teaching you." Alderman looked at her for a long moment. "That's all you want?" "That's all I want," she said. He extended his hand. "Deal," he said. It was the same day Alderman left that Caldwell made his move, not against Clara. That was the thing that caught her completely off guard, because she had been so focused on what he might do to her operation that she hadn't thought carefully enough about the other angle. He went after Martha. She found out from Martha herself, who came to her door on Thursday morning with an expression that Clara had never seen on her face before. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of a woman who has been reminded that she is not, after all, invulnerable. "He came to see me yesterday evening," Martha said. Clara stepped back from the door. "Come in. Sit down." Martha sat. She folded her hands on the table with the deliberate composure of a woman steadying herself. "I was polite," she said. "That's the first thing. He was very polite. He sat in my kitchen, and he drank my coffee, and he asked about my farm and my health, and how the season had been." She paused. "And then he told me that he'd been looking at my deed, and he believed there was an irregularity in the original survey of my eastern boundary." Clara felt the cold settle in. "The same thing he tried with me," she said. "A version of it." Martha's voice was steady, but Clara could hear the effort it took to make it so. "My eastern boundary abuts the Hendricks property. The survey was done in 1854. Caldwell says there's an overlap of approximately 200 feet that should be his." 200 feet, Clara said. "That's your best soil. That's where you grow the strawberry plants you've been giving me runners from." "Yes," Martha said simply. The precision of it made Clara's stomach turn. This wasn't random. Caldwell had done his research. He knew exactly which 200 feet of Martha's land mattered most to the operation Clara had built, and he had found, or manufactured, a legal pretext to reach for it. "He's going after you because going after me directly stopped working," Clara said. Martha looked at her steadily. "I know that," she said. "He thinks if he takes your land, or just makes it legally uncertain, he can destabilize the whole operation," Martha said. "My runners supply 3 of your 5 farms. If I lose that eastern section, I lose half my production capacity." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm 71 years old, Clara. I don't have the energy for a legal fight. I have the money for it, but—" "You're not fighting it alone," Clara said. "Clara, no." Her voice came out with a force she hadn't planned. "Martha, you were the first person who believed me. You gave me plants on credit when I had nothing. You wrote to Francis Holt. You have been the foundation of everything this cooperative has become." She leaned forward. "You are not fighting this alone." Martha looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in that face. The composed, careful face of a woman who had been managing alone for so many years that being told she didn't have to had become almost incomprehensible. "All right," Martha said quietly. "I'm going to Crane," Clara said. "Today." She was at Crane's office within the hour. Crane listened, made notes, asked 3 precise questions, and then said, "An 1854 survey. That's before the territory was formally mapped." He tapped his pen against the desk. "There are often irregularities in those early surveys. Sometimes genuine, sometimes manufactured by someone who knows how to read the ambiguity. Can you find out which this is? I can hire a surveyor to do a current assessment of the boundary," he said. "If the current line matches the 1854 deed, Caldwell's claim evaporates. If there's a genuine discrepancy, then what?" "Then we negotiate," he said. "But Clara, a genuine discrepancy in a survey that old is rare. My instinct is that this is manufactured uncertainty, not real uncertainty." "His instinct seems to be that we can't afford to fight it." Crane nodded slowly. "Which is why he went after Martha instead of you. He figures a 71-year-old woman farming alone is softer than you've proven to be." Clara's jaw tightened. "He figured wrong," she said. Crane almost smiled. "I'll have a surveyor out there by Monday," he said. She went directly from Crane's office to Will Hatcher. She found him in his barn repairing a frame from the storm, working with the focused economy of motion she'd come to recognize as his natural state. "Caldwell went after Martha," she said. Will set down his tools. She told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd come to depend on in him, that he received serious information seriously, without performing a reaction before he had time to actually form one. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What does he think is going to happen? That we fall apart if he takes Martha out?" "I think that's exactly what he thinks," Clara said. "He's been watching us wrong," Will said. It was said with a simplicity that made it land harder than analysis would have. "He's been looking at us the way he looks at everything. Who's the center? How do you take out the center? He thinks you're the center, and Martha's what's holding you up." And we're not built that way," Will said. "Not anymore." He picked up his hammer again. "You should tell the others, all of them, tonight if you can." She did. She called the meeting for that evening, all 5 of them in her kitchen, which was the first time they'd met inside rather than on the hillside, and the smaller space made it feel different, more immediate, more real. The 5 of them around her kitchen table with coffee and the lamplight and the knowledge of what they were dealing with. She laid it out clean. The survey claim. The 200 feet. What it meant for Martha's production, and therefore for the runner's supply, and therefore for everyone's capacity to expand next season. No one spoke for a moment when she finished. Then Pete Sorensen said, "He's not going to stop." "No," Clara said. "Even if this doesn't work, he'll find something else." "Probably." Pete looked at his coffee cup. "So we make it so that stopping us doesn't make sense anymore. We get big enough and connected enough and known enough that coming after any one piece of us is too visible and too costly." Clara looked at him. Pete Sorensen, who had said all right when she asked if he was in and had not, in the subsequent months, said much more than that. Pete Sorensen, who farmed alone and spoke rarely, and whose analysis, when it came, was always worth the wait. "That's exactly right," she said. "Then we need to move faster," he said. "The Denver contract, the Cooper County connection, the other farmers who've been asking since the storm. We need to bring them in sooner rather than later." Robert Jenks was nodding. "He can go after one of us," Robert said. "He can't go after all of us at once, not without it looking like what it is." "And if it looks like what it is," Eliza said quietly, "people start choosing sides. And they won't choose his." The room was quiet for a moment. Clara looked around the table. 5 people. 5 different reasons for being here. 5 different histories of what the valley had done to them and what they had done back. "All right," she said, "then we move faster." The surveyor Crane hired came out on Monday and spent the entire day on Martha's eastern boundary. Clara was there, not to interfere but to be present, because Martha had asked her to be, and because some things you show up for, even when there is nothing useful you can do except stand there. The surveyor was a methodical man named Hicks, who took measurements with the concentrated patience of someone who understands that getting this right matters more than getting it done quickly. He didn't make conversation. He didn't offer preliminary opinions. He simply worked. At 4 in the afternoon, he packed up his equipment. He looked at Clara. He looked at Martha. "The current boundary," he said, "matches the 1854 deed within 2 feet, which is within standard tolerance for the surveying methods of the period." He paused. "There is no valid basis for a boundary dispute." Martha closed her eyes for 1 second. Then she opened them and said, "Thank you, Mr. Hicks." Hicks nodded and left. Clara reached over and put her hand over Martha's on the fence post between them. Martha did not pull away. Neither of them said anything. Some things don't need words. Some things are just two women standing in the late afternoon on land that one of them has earned and almost lost. And the relief of that is too large and too real to fit inside language. Crane filed the response to Caldwell's survey claim by Wednesday. By Thursday, the claim was withdrawn. Exactly as it had been with the water rights, the moment actual evidence appeared, the challenge evaporated. That was the pattern, Clara realized. He was probing for weakness, not committing to battles he couldn't win. Each attempt was a test of whether they, had the resources and knowledge and legal standing to fight back. Each withdrawal meant he hadn't found the soft spot yet, but he was still looking. She knew it. What she didn't know was that the thing Caldwell was going to do next was something she couldn't fight with a lawyer. He went to the newspaper. The Willow Creek Register was a 4-page weekly run by a man named Douglas Finch, who was not in Caldwell's pocket exactly, but was the kind of editor who understood which direction his advertising came from. The issue that arrived on Friday had, on its 3rd page, a story under the headline, "Questions Arise Over Cooperative Farming Methods." Clara read it at the kitchen table. She read it twice. It was careful. Nothing outright false. It cited no sources by name. Several experienced farmers have expressed concern. And it raised questions rather than making claims. Questions about whether the barrel method was truly replicable or whether it had succeeded under specific conditions that couldn't be generalized. Questions about whether a cooperative run without formal legal structure was a sound arrangement for the farmers involved. Questions about whether first-season results were a reliable indicator of long-term viability. It mentioned Harrison Caldwell in the 3rd paragraph, describing him as a veteran farmer with significant investment in modernizing the valley's agricultural capacity, who was pursuing his own experimental methods. It did not mention Clara by name anywhere in the story. She folded the paper. She sat with it for a while. There was something about this particular move that felt different from the water rights and the survey claim and the supply interference. Those had been direct. Those had been things she could respond to through action, through lawyers and supply lines and contracts and showing up. This was a story. This was the way a thing looked, which was different from what a thing was, and she knew, better than most, how much the way a thing looked could matter. She thought about the people in this valley who hadn't made up their minds yet. The farmers who'd been watching since the storm, who were curious and considering but hadn't come to her yet. The buyers who were interested but hadn't committed. The people in town who'd seen her on the hillside with barrels and decided to wait and see. They would read this story, and a story that raised questions, carefully, without accusations, just questions, was a powerful thing because questions planted in uncertain minds grew in ways that direct attacks didn't. She picked up the paper and walked to Finch's office. Douglas Finch was a thin, nervous man who did not enjoy confrontation. He looked up from his desk when Clara walked in with that expression of a man who has been waiting for this and is not particularly glad it has arrived. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Douglas." She set the paper on his desk, open to the 3rd page. "Who gave you this story?" He straightened some papers on his desk that didn't need straightening. I receive information from various sources. Who gave you this story? The nervous energy in his hands stilled. I'm not able to reveal. You don't need to, Clara said. I know who it was. I'm asking because I want you to understand what was given to you and what it was given for. She sat down in the chair across his desk without being invited. Every question in that story can be answered. Would you like me to answer them? He blinked. The question's about replicability, she said. I have 4 other farms running the same method with documented results. I have a buyer from Denver who came to this valley herself to evaluate the operation. I have a farmer from Cooper County who visited last week and is implementing the method on his own land. She paused. Would you like those names? Would you like their statements? Finch looked at her. The question's about legal structure, she said. I have a lawyer. The cooperative is filing formal organization papers next month. I have contracts with 2 major buyers and documentation of every season's production. She leaned forward slightly. The question's about long-term viability. I have 2 full seasons of records showing consistent results. I have a buyer who extended her contract after reviewing those records. Finch was very still. You were given a story, Clara said quietly. I'm offering you a better one, the true one. She looked at him steadily. You're a journalist, Douglas, not an instrument. Which story do you want to run? The silence in the office lasted a long time. Then Finch picked up his pen. I'd need statements, he said, from the other farmers, and from your buyers. You'll have them by Monday, Clara said. She stood up. Clara, Finch said. She turned. He looked at the paper on his desk, at the story he'd run, with the expression of a man taking a careful accounting of himself and not entirely satisfied with what he found. I should have asked more questions before I ran it, he said. Yes, she said. You should have. She left. She spent the weekend collecting statements from Will, Eliza, Pete, Robert, and Martha, each of them handwritten, specific, and signed. From Fitch, who sent a letter by return post that was 2 paragraphs of precise professional endorsement. From Francis Holt, who wrote 3 sentences that were worth more than 3 paragraphs from anyone else. And from David Alderman of Cooper County, who had returned home and already broken ground on his first barrel installation, and who wrote, in the direct language of a man with no reason to embellish, the method works. I have seen it with my own eyes, and I am doing it on my own land. Anyone who questions that has not looked. She delivered the packet to Finch on Monday morning. The following Friday's Register ran a 2-column story on the second page. Willow Creek Cooperative demonstrates new future for hillside farming. It had her name in it, not buried, in the second sentence. She read it at the kitchen table with her coffee. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the drawer with Thomas's ledger and the hotel contract, and Francis Holt's first letter, and Crane's legal filings, and all the other pieces of paper that were the documentary record of a year she would spend the rest of her life understanding. Caldwell said nothing publicly about the story, but Silas stopped appearing on the road below her property. The interference with her suppliers stopped. The legal challenges stopped. He did not come to see her. She did not go to see him. There was no dramatic confrontation, no moment of surrender or acknowledgement. Men like Harrison Caldwell did not do those things. They recalibrated quietly and moved on to the next thing. And eventually the next thing was somewhere else, because the value of fighting her had dropped below whatever threshold he used for calculating whether a battle was worth his time. He was still in the valley. He was still wealthy. He was still the largest single landholder in Willow Creek, but he was no longer the person who decided what the valley's farming future looked like. That conversation was happening somewhere else now. In a cooperative meeting in Clara's kitchen, on Will Hatcher's North Ridge, in Francis Holt's procurement office in Denver, in a letter from a Cooper County farmer who was breaking ground on his first barrel installation. The valley was bigger than Caldwell had been able to see. That was his fundamental error, Clara thought. Not the specific moves he'd made or the specific tools he'd used, but the underlying assumption that had driven all of it. He had seen the valley as a fixed thing with a fixed amount of value and a fixed number of people who got to claim it, and his job was to make sure he kept the largest share. He had never been able to see that she was making more. She was sitting with that thought on the hillside on a Thursday evening in late September when Will Hatcher came up to check the end-of-season barrels and found her sitting there, which he did not comment on because he had learned when she needed talking to and when she needed quiet, and he sat down nearby, and they both looked at the valley for a while. "What are you thinking about?" he said finally. "Thomas," she said. Will was quiet. "I used to say we'd figure it out," she said. "About the hill. He always said that. We'll figure it out." She looked at the valley below. "I used to think it was just something he said. Something optimistic and not particularly useful." She paused. "But he was right. We did figure it out." "You figured it out," Will said. "We," she said. "All of us." Will turned the hat in his hands. This was something he did when he was thinking through something carefully, she had noticed. The hat turning, the particular set of his jaw. "Clara," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Yes." "What happens next? With the cooperative? With all of this?" He looked at her. "You've built something." Caldwell backed off. "The contracts are in place. The method is spreading to other counties." He paused. "What are you building toward?" She thought about it. The real answer. Not the practical answer about next season's planting, or the formal legal structure of the cooperative, or the expansion to Cooper County. The other answer. The one she'd been living toward without being able to name it yet. "I want this valley to be a place where having the wrong kind of land isn't a death sentence," she said. "Where a woman with 6 acres of rock and no money, and no one standing with her, has the same chance as anyone else. Where what you know and what you're willing to do matters more than what you started with." She was quiet for a moment. "That's not something you finish building, but you can start it." Will looked at her for a long time. "Thomas was a lucky man," he said. Clara felt something catch in her chest. She pressed it down, the way she always did. "He was a good one," she said. "That's rarer." Will nodded once, put his hat back on, stood up. "I'll finish the end-of-season check on the south barrels," he said. "Thank you, Will." He went. She stayed on the hillside. The valley below her was moving into autumn. That particular quality of late September light that turned everything golden and final, the color of things completing themselves. She could see, from where she sat, the places where the barrel farms had spread. Will's Ridge to the north, the shapes of Eliza's expanded operation to the west, and if she looked carefully, the places where new frames were going in on properties that had never produced anything before. She could not see Caldwell's operation from here. That was fine. She picked up a handful of soil from the base of the nearest barrel. Her best barrel, the first one. The one that had produced the first flowers and the first fruit and the first real evidence that she hadn't been wrong. She held it in her palm. The soil was dark and rich from a full season's work. It was not the pale, thin soil of the hillside she'd inherited. It was something she had made, literally made, with compost and sand and wood chips and 2 seasons of care, out of nothing that anyone else had wanted. She thought about her mother. Some things won't grow where the world expects them to. She let the soil fall back into the barrel. She stood up. She had a cooperative meeting tomorrow morning, and the formal organization papers to review with Crane, and a letter to write to David Alderman about the next growing season, and end-of-season records to complete, and a decision to make about whether to take on the 2 new farmers who'd come asking since the storm. The work was not finished. The work, she understood now, was never finished. But it was hers. She climbed down from the hillside in the last of the September light, and the valley around her held what she had helped to put into it, and the woman who had driven a shovel into frozen ground 3 weeks after burying her husband was still here, still building, still refusing every definition of herself that had been handed to her from outside. She went inside. She put the kettle on. She sat at the kitchen table where Thomas's ledger lived in the drawer, and Francis Holt's letters and Crane's papers, and the newspaper story with her name in the second sentence, and she thought about what Will had asked her. "What are you building toward?" She opened the ledger to a new page. She picked up her pencil, and she began to write. The new page in Thomas's ledger stayed blank for a long time that night. Not because Clara didn't know what to write. She knew exactly what she wanted to write. She had been living toward it for 18 months, and the shape of it was clear in her mind. The formal structure of the cooperative, the expanded supply agreements, the method documented in enough detail that anyone with rocky hillside land and the willingness to learn could replicate what she'd built without needing her standing there to explain it. The page stayed blank because she was thinking about Thomas. She did that sometimes, still. Sat at this table with his ledger in front of her and let herself be in the specific gravity of his absence for a few minutes before she picked up the pencil and went back to work. It was not the drowning kind of grief anymore. That had been the first months, the weight that sat on her chest in the pre-dawn dark and made getting up an act of will rather than habit. This was something different. Quieter. The particular weight of carrying someone with you into a life they didn't get to see. She thought about what he would have made of all of it. The barrels, the contracts. Caldwell retreating. 5 farmers where there had been one. A story in the register with her name in the second sentence. She thought he would have laughed, not at the magnitude of it. Thomas wasn't a man who was easily impressed by scale. He would have laughed at the specific detail that had started all of it. Old barrels. Rotting in the dirt behind the barn, right there on their own property, the whole time. "We'll figure it out," he'd said. She picked up the pencil. She wrote the date at the top of the page. October 3rd, 1879. Then she wrote, Year 2. What we know and what we intend. She wrote until midnight. The document she produced over the following week, sitting at the kitchen table in the mornings before the day's work started, and again in the evenings after it ended, was not a formal legal paper. Crane would handle the formal papers. This was something different. It was the record of how the method had developed, written in plain language so that anyone could read it. The reasoning behind every decision. The mistakes she'd made in the first season and what she'd learned from them. The soil ratios that worked and why. The spacing that maximized production on north-facing versus south-facing slopes. The frost protection measures. The varieties that performed best at elevation. She wrote it the way her mother had taught her to do things worth preserving. Carefully, completely, without leaving out the parts that hadn't worked. Because the parts that hadn't worked were sometimes more useful than the parts that had. When she was done, she showed it to Martha first. Martha read it at her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, all 12 pages, without speaking. She turned the pages with the careful attention of a reader who is checking something against their own deep knowledge of a subject rather than learning it fresh. When she finished, she set it down. She looked at Clara. "This is good," she said. "This is genuinely good." "Is it accurate?" "It's more than accurate. It's complete." Martha tapped the pages. "You've written down things that took me 40 years to understand about this soil. Things I couldn't have told you directly. You had to discover them yourself, in your own way, on your specific land." She looked up. "This is a document that could change what a person is able to do with land everyone else gave up on." "That's the idea," Clara said. "How many copies are you making?" Clara had thought about this. "One for every farmer in the cooperative," she said. "One for Crane's files. One for Frances Holt, so she understands the method behind what she's buying. One for David Alderman in Cooper County." She paused. "And I want to send one to the Agricultural Extension in Denver. If there's a way to get it into the hands of the people who advise farmers across the territory." "There is," Martha said. "I know the man who runs it." She was already reaching for her pen. "I'll write the letter today." Clara smiled. Not the restrained, careful smile she used in public. The real one. The one that took up her whole face. "Of course you do," she said. Martha wrote the letter. The letter went to Denver. And 3 weeks later, a response came back from the Colorado Agricultural Extension that Clara read, standing at her kitchen door in the October morning, with the envelope still warm from having been carried from the depot. They wanted to publish the document, not as a pamphlet. As a formal agricultural guide, with the extension's endorsement, distributed to farmers across Colorado Territory. Clara read the letter twice. Then she sat down on the porch step. She sat there for a while. She thought about the spring of 1878, the frozen ground, and the barrels, and the $200 offer, and Harrison Caldwell's voice. "A woman like you can't do much of anything." She thought about her mother's strawberries in the raised planter, the seeds pressed into dark soil with one thumb while a child watched. She thought about the mornings she'd gotten up before sunrise, and the nights she'd worked by lamplight, and the day she'd sat on the hillside and cried over white flowers and the contract in the kitchen drawer, and Martha's letter, and Will Hatcher arriving to help without being asked, and Robert Jenks saying my wife would have liked you with his grief plain in his voice. She thought about all the people who had looked at her and seen a limitation. She got up. She went inside. She wrote back to the extension and said yes. The formal cooperative meeting happened on the 15th of October in Clara's kitchen, with Crane present to guide the organization of the legal structure and all 5 farmers around the table. They had added 2 new members since the storm. A widow named Grace Tully, who had a 1/4 acre on the eastern ridge, and the focused determination of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening, and a man named Samuel Bird, who was half Arapaho, had been farming the rocky ground north of town for 8 years without anyone paying much attention, and who turned out, when Clara walked his land with him, to have developed his own version of elevated container growing independently, with clay pots rather than barrels, with results that were different from hers, but equally instructive. When she'd seen Samuel Bird's clay pot system, she'd stood in the middle of it for a long moment without speaking. He'd watched her. "You figured this out on your own?" she said. "Took me 4 years," he said. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" He'd looked at her with an expression that said everything the words didn't need to. She understood. She had brought him to meet the cooperative the following week. Will Hatcher had shaken his hand without ceremony. Eliza Marsh had asked him 3 immediate and specific questions about his clay pot drainage method. Pete Sorensen had said all right in his usual tone, which by now everyone understood meant welcome. Robert Jenks had been the one Clara watched most carefully, had watched the moment Robert understood he was being asked to build something with a man the valley had spent 8 years not looking at. Robert had looked at Samuel's documentation of his clay pot method for a long moment. Then he'd said, "Your drainage design is better than mine." Samuel had said, "Your soil ratios are better than mine." And that had been that. 7 farmers around the table now, on October 15th, with Crane explaining the legal structure and Agnes Perkins's niece, who had been studying accounting in Denver, taking minutes in a notebook. Crane walked them through the organization papers, the cooperative structure, the shared liability arrangement, the decision-making process, the records requirements. Then he said, "You'll need a name." The table went quiet. Clara had been thinking about this without settling on anything. Names were harder than they seemed. They had to hold the thing they named without being too large or too small for it. And this particular thing was still growing, still becoming, and she wasn't sure yet what the right word was for what it was. "The Barrel Cooperative," Will said. A few people smiled. "That's what everyone's going to call it anyway," Eliza said. Martha, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table, not a member, but present, because everyone had agreed without discussion that Martha would always be present, looked up. "Whitmore Method Farms," she said. The table went quiet again, differently. Clara shook her head immediately. "No," she said. "Clara, no, this isn't mine. It hasn't been just mine since the 2nd month." She looked around the table. "It belongs to everyone who built it. It should be named for what it is, not for where it started." Martha looked at her for a long moment. Then she said softly, "Your mother would be very proud of you." Clara felt something move through her chest. Something she pressed down, the way she always did, because there were 7 people around this table, and Crane had more to cover. "Hillside Cooperative," Pete Sorensen said. Everyone looked at him. "That's what we are," he said. "Hillside farmers. Land nobody wanted. That's the whole thing in 2 words." Nobody argued. Crane wrote it at the top of the organization paper. Willow Creek Hillside Cooperative. Established October 15th. 1879. 7 farmers signed it. Clara signed last. She wrote her name, Clara Whitmore, in the same deliberate hand she'd used for Thomas's ledger and Francis Holt's contracts and the agricultural method document and every letter she'd written over the past 18 months that had mattered. She set the pen down. Outside, October was moving through the valley in that particular way it had. The cottonwoods along the creek turning gold, the quality of light going lower and more golden, the barrels on the hillsides standing through the end of their first full cooperative season, with fruit still on the late-producing plants. Done, she thought. Not finished. Never finished. But done. The way something is done when it has moved from the category of fragile possibility into the category of real existing thing. When it has a name and a structure and 7 signatures and a legal paper and a story in the register and a forthcoming publication from the Agricultural Extension and a buyer in Denver and a connection in Cooper County and a method document that Martha was going to make sure got into the right hands. Real. It was real now. She had not let herself feel the full weight of that until this moment, sitting at this kitchen table with the pen still warm in her hand. She felt it now. Caldwell heard about the cooperative organization within 2 days. She knew, because Silas appeared on the road below her property on a Thursday morning for the first time in weeks. Not standing, not watching, just riding slowly past, the way a man rides past something he is trying to understand. She watched him from the porch. He did not look up. She went back inside. She thought about going to Caldwell directly. She had thought about it more than once over the past months, walking to his door the way he had walked to hers, presenting herself as the equal she had always been, having the conversation plainly. She had decided against it each time, and she thought about why. It was not fear. It was not avoidance. It was the understanding that there was nothing she needed from Harrison Caldwell. Not his acknowledgement, not his respect, not his concession. She had built something that did not require his approval, and going to him would suggest she wanted it. She did not want it. She wanted to keep farming. That was the thing, finally, beneath all of it. She wanted to be on her hillside with her hands in the soil, and her barrels producing, and her people doing the same on their hillsides. And she wanted next season to be bigger and better and further than this season. And she wanted the document that the Agricultural Extension was going to publish to reach the people who needed it. And she wanted some farmer in a county she'd never heard of to read it, and look at the rocky hillside land they'd been told was worthless, and think, maybe not. That was what she wanted. Not vindication, not confrontation, not the moment where the man who had underestimated her was forced to acknowledge it. Just the work, just the land, just the next season. The letter from David Alderman came in November. She opened it at the kitchen table in the early morning, before anyone else was moving in the valley, with her coffee going cold and the lamp still lit against the dark. Mrs. Whitmore, he wrote, I wanted to tell you that our first barrel harvest came in last week. I won't pretend it was as good as yours. First seasons never are, as you told me. But it was something. It was real. My wife picked the first strawberries herself, and she stood in the field and cried, and I am not ashamed to tell you that I did too. We have 3 other farmers in our county who are starting their barrel installations next spring. 2 of them came to see our operation this month, and I showed them everything you showed me. I told them the same thing you told me. When it works for you, teach the next person. They said they would. I believe them. David Alderman. Clara read the letter twice. She folded it and held it in both hands for a moment. David Alderman's wife standing in a field crying over the first strawberries. 3 Cooper County farmers starting installations next spring. The thing moving, spreading, going further than Clara could see from her hillside. She put the letter in the drawer with the others. She got up and went to work. The winter was quiet. The valley settled into the slower rhythm of cold months. The planning, the preparation, the rebuilding and reviewing that farming required in its off-season. Clara spent it the way she'd spent the previous winter, except that everything was different now. The work at the table was not survival calculation. It was expansion planning. The letters she wrote were not defenses. They were connections. The meetings in her kitchen were not 5 people figuring out how to hold together. They were 7 people figuring out how to grow. Samuel Bird came by on a December afternoon with a question about barrel wood treatment for cold weather preservation, and they spent 2 hours at the kitchen table working through it together. His knowledge of clay pot insulation crossing with her knowledge of barrel wood behavior to produce something neither of them had worked out individually. She wrote it down. She added it to the method document. Martha came for coffee twice a week, which had become the rhythm of their relationship. Not the crisis-driven visits of the previous year, but the ordinary, sustaining rhythm of two women who had built a friendship out of shared work and mutual respect. They talked about the next season. They talked about the agricultural extension publication, which was going through a review process and would be released in the spring. They talked about Grace Tully, who had expanded faster than anyone and was now producing as much per barrel as Clara's third-year plants, which said something both about Grace's talent and about how well the method had been transmitted. They talked about other things too, personal things. The particular texture of being a woman alone, and what it cost, and what it gave back. The way grief changed shape over time without going away. The strange freedom of not having to be anything other than what you were when there was nobody left to perform for. One afternoon in January, Martha said something that stayed with Clara for a long time afterward. They were sitting with their coffee and the winter light coming through the window, and Martha said, out of nowhere, in the way she sometimes produced observations, as if she'd been carrying them for a while and had decided now was the right moment. "Do you know what I think about when I look at what you've built?" Clara shook her head. "I think about all the women before you who had the same idea," Martha said. "Women who looked at the wrong-shaped land and thought, maybe. Women who tried something nobody expected. Women who didn't have the luck or the timing or the buyer who happened to eat a strawberry at the right moment." She looked at her cup. "They existed. They always existed. We just never heard about them." Clara was quiet. "This time," Martha said, "we're writing it down." The agricultural extension pamphlet was published in March of 1880. It was 8 pages, printed on good paper, with a header that read, "Hillside Barrel Cultivation, a Method for Rocky and Elevated Terrain, developed by Clara Whitmore, Willow Creek, Colorado Territory." Published with the endorsement of the Colorado Agricultural Extension. It had her name on the cover. She held the first copy in both hands in her kitchen. She stood there for a long time. Then she did something she had not done in a long time and had not planned to do now. She walked to the drawer and took out Thomas's ledger and opened it to the first page, where his handwriting was. The careful slanted numbers and notes from when they had first started trying to figure out what to do with the hillside. She put the pamphlet on the table next to the ledger. His handwriting and her name. The problem they had both stared at, and the answer she had found. She stood there with both of them in front of her and let herself be in that for a minute. The full weight of it, the distance traveled, the cost of the travel, and the thing that had been built. Then she closed the ledger. She put it back in the drawer. She picked up her coat and walked out to the hillside. Spring was starting in the way. Colorado spring started, cautiously, with setbacks, the warmth arriving and retreating before it committed. The barrels were still in their winter positions, frames solid, some showing the early moisture of soil beginning to wake up. She would start planting in 3 weeks. She had more barrels this season than last, 26 producing units on her own hillside, with the cooperative running nearly 80 barrels across 7 farms. She stood at the top of the hill. Below her, the valley was the same valley it had always been. Willow Creek with its rooftops and cottonwoods, the flat fields beginning to turn as farmers prepared for planting, the road that ran south toward Pueblo and north toward Denver, the same geography she had looked at from this hill her whole life. But the hillsides were different, not dramatically. You had to know what you were looking at to see it. But the shapes on the ridges were different. The barrel frames on Will's North Ridge, the expanded installation on Eliza's half-acre. Samuel Bird's clay pot rose on the north property, visible even from here as a different pattern, a different logic applied to the same problem. Grace Tully's hillside, which had gone from nothing to producing in a single season with a speed that still surprised everyone. 7 farms where there had been one. A cooperative with a name and a legal structure, and a Denver buyer, and an agricultural extension pamphlet with her name on the cover. And somewhere in Cooper County, David Alderman's wife had cried over the first strawberries while 3 other farmers watched and thought, maybe we could do this too. And the 3 farmers who'd come from the east side of the valley after the storm, they were planting this spring. And whoever read the pamphlet and looked at their own rocky hillside and thought, maybe. The thing was moving now, beyond what she could track or plan for, out past the edges of what she had intended, into the hands of people she would never meet, being changed and adapted and applied to land she would never walk and problems she would never know about, in the way that useful knowledge moves when you let it go. Her mother had pressed seeds into dark soil with one thumb while a child watched. She had watched. And then she had grown up and inherited a rocky hillside and a set of rotting barrels and a husband who said, "We'll figure it out," and then died before the figuring was done. And she had figured it out, not because she was stronger than the situation, not because she was fearless or brilliant or in possession of some quality that other people lacked. She had figured it out because she had been willing to look at the thing everyone else had already given up on and ask, what does it need? Not what do I need it to be? What does it need? She had been willing to be wrong about the answer and to try again. She had been willing to ask for help and to give it freely when it came back around. She had been willing to refuse. Not once, but over and over, in the 100 different forms that refusal had to take. To accept what she'd been told about the value of the land and the limits of her body and the ceiling on what a woman in her position could reasonably expect. She stood on her hillside. Her barrels were around her. Her cooperative was below her. Her name was on a pamphlet in the hands of strangers. And the valley, her valley, the valley that had tried to reduce her to a $200 transaction, that had laughed when she dragged barrels up a rocky hill, that had whispered about her size and her grief and her stubbornness and her refusal to go to Denver and start over somewhere easier. The valley was growing something it hadn't grown before. Not just strawberries. Something harder to name and more important. The knowledge that the land people reject is not useless. The knowledge that the woman people underestimate is not powerless. The knowledge that sometimes the thing you need most is already there, waiting, and what it requires from you is not genius or money or perfect timing. It only requires someone patient enough to see what it already is, and stubborn enough to act on what they see, and generous enough to share it when it works. Clara bent down. She pressed her hand into the soil of the nearest barrel. Her first barrel, the one that had produced the first white flowers, the one she had sat beside and cried when the flowers came. The soil was cold still. Not ready. A few weeks yet. But it was alive. She could feel it. The particular aliveness of soil that has been cared for, that holds memory of the roots that have grown through it, and the hands that have tended it, and the seasons it has survived. She stood up. She looked at her hands. Then she looked at the valley. Clara Whitmore had arrived on this hillside as a widow with a debt and a shovel and 6 acres that nobody wanted. She left it every evening as herself, the founder of a cooperative, the author of a method, the woman who had looked at broken barrels and seen the future of a valley. She had not become someone else. She had become more fully who she already was, and the hillside that everyone had called worthless bloomed every season now, would bloom next season, would bloom after she was gone, tended by hands that had learned from her hands, carrying forward a knowledge that had started with a mother pressing seeds into dark soil in Tennessee and had traveled, through grief and stubbornness and an absolute refusal to be small, all the way here, to this hillside, to these barrels, to a valley that had learned, slowly and not without resistance, that the woman everyone underestimated had known something from the beginning that it had taken them too long to see. The land was not the problem. It never had been. They had simply not yet met the person willing to understand it.